Oh, yes. We got a show coming. The Current Affairs podcast is doing its first live show on Saturday, January 26th at the Rock and Roll Hotel in D.C. You can find tickets on the Rock and Roll Hotel website or on Eventbrite. It's going to be fun. It's going to be weird because we're weird. So there are going to be costumes, live music, more costumes. Nathan brought a volcano with like gummies that will go inside of them. Anyway, it's going to be a trip.
Amazing. Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. And we have a special guest with us today. A hearty welcome to Vanessa Bee.
Hi.
Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Yeah.
We're privileged to have you.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's as we're recording this, it's Martin Luther King Day, which is the day of the best takes online, the finest Twitter and Facebook comments you could possibly imagine. The most recent one I saw, just to pay honor to Martin Luther King's legacy, was Eric Erickson said that the liberal media was judging the MAGA chud children who are yelling at that Native American guy by the color of their caps. So they were basically doing racism against these poor Catholic kids. So cheers to that. But what we actually wanted to talk about today was actually in the actual spirit of Martin Luther King Day and not the bastardized conservative version where MLK would be a Benghazi truther and want to build the wall, is the idea of white identity and what that is, what it means to white Americans. And I guess probably similar conversations could happen in many other countries, but basically kind of want to take a look at an ongoing debate that's been happening between kind of two poles. And I think on one pole, we'll put this clip in, there's Martin Luther King, who puts the idea of whiteness, and he tells a story of these prison guards in Birmingham, and says that they are being economically victimized, that they are not making very much money, and that the only thing that, their wages of whiteness are just this false belief that they're superior to other people because they're white.
I always try to do a little converting when I'm in jail. And when we were in jail in Birmingham the other day, the white wardens and all enjoyed coming around the cell to talk about the race problem. And they were showing us where we were so wrong demonstrating. And they were showing us where segregation was so right. And they were showing us where intermarriage was so wrong. So I would get to preaching, and we would get to talking calmly because they wanted to talk about it. And then we got down one day to the point, that was the second or third day, to talk about where they lived and how much they were earning. And when those brothers told me what they were earning, I said, now, you know what? You ought to be marching with us. You just as poor as Negro. And I said, you are put in the position of supporting your oppressor because through prejudice and blindness you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in American society oppress poor white people. And all you are living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you are somebody big because you're white. And you're so poor you can't send your children to school. You ought to be out here marching with every one of us every time we have a march.
And sort of in a similar vein, James Baldwin, and we'll put this one in too, he says that Very, very interesting argument. He says that what's happened to white people in the South, and I would think probably he would agree a lot of the North too, what's happened to those white people is in some ways worse than what's happened to the black people there. Because despite all the beatings and Jim Crow and stuff, that the moral lives of white Alabama ladies has been poisoned, that people have become monsters.
But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse.
And so that's kind of one pole of the debate. The other pole of the debate is the folks who say that whiteness is a kind of positive interest. And I think Ta-Nehisi Coates is the most prominent exponent of this view, which is that from an article, he talks about white solidarity in an article from 2016, which we'll link here, and he says that in America, solidarity among laborers is not the only kind of solidarity. In America, it isn't even the most potent kind. Skipping a little bit, at every step, universalist social programs have been hampered by the idea of becoming and remaining forever white. So it was with the New Deal. So it is with Obamacare. So it would be with President Sanders. That is not because the white working class labors under mass hypnosis. It is because whiteness confers knowable, quantifiable privileges regardless of class, much like manhood confers knowable, quantifiable privileges regardless of race. White supremacy is neither a trick nor a device, but one of the most powerful shared interests in American history. And that, too, is solidarity. So that's kind of setting up, the debate, I think, which is very much a live one. You see folks bringing this up with Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, putting their hat into the presidential ring. And I suppose the first question I'd like to ask you, Vanessa, is, standing from outside of that perspective, what is your sort of gut reaction to that? Like, as someone who, is not either benefiting or, is not part of that sort of group.
I sympathize, I think, with the argument that Ta-Nehisi Coates tries to make. And I sympathize, but I think it doesn't give enough credit where credit is due. So I think he's right in that supremacy has a way of working its way into even policy efforts that are supposed to have these universal qualities and sort of lift everyone up together regardless of their ethnic background. and that we saw that with some of the New Deal programs. But then you look at that essay from 2016, and it leaves out like the deliberate efforts to inject white supremacy into these programs, right? It's not like the programs just like magically, it's not like everyone woke up the next day and like made a concerted effort to shut the doors to, say, Black applicants. No, it's like those were written into the laws. And so if we're conscious of these weaknesses, like if we understand our weak points and we understand how these universal programs in the past have been used to exclude people, even in other arenas like, say, public housing, it's hard for me to understand why when we talk about the future and the potential of reviving these programs, and I don't know why we start from the losing position that we will cede to to any sort of demands to exclude Black people or Native American people or other vulnerable populations from these programs. Like, if we're aware of them, why are we acting like it's a given that the purposeful exclusion will happen again? So I have a hard time kind of, I don't know, it feels a little like a sleight of hand, and I don't want to like ascribe, different motives to Ta-Nehisi Coates, because I think he is a great thinker, but that's just sort of a weak point that stands out to me.
That's interesting, Vanessa, because it suggests that he thinks unless the primary focus and emphasis is on race specifically, that naturally those exclusionary parts will occur. Whereas I think kind of what you're saying is those things happened intentionally. That was part of like political work that effectuated that exclusion and that racism. And so it is a good sleight of hand. That's a good way to put it, that Bernie Sanders and his supporters, clearly, I think, wouldn't purposefully try to have that exclusion as part of the policies they push. So is it then true that it would naturally happen otherwise? Because for me, this debate, I've been trying to figure out how semantic it is, because I think both sides, when they're being intellectually honest, admit that race and capitalism are inextricable, right? So I've long tried to figure out, like, what are we really talking about here? What is the actual difference? Is it emphasis? Like, why do we think we're on different sides here? And so maybe you've put your finger on it,
Yeah. I don't, that's definitely a good point, and I guess historically you can point out that like part of the New Deal coalition was Jim Crow Southern Democrats, where they were literally living in a sort of terrorist apartheid state where there was no Black political representation. And that's why all those structures got built into the New Deal programs, because FDR needed those votes to pass them. And, one of the benefits to a like structurally universalist program is that by definition, if you can actually pass it, it literally does not leave anyone out. And I think that's a good point to make. I guess,
Vanessa, you wanted to jump in there. Did you want to jump in?
At the same, these universal programs, I think, I do think I agree with you, Ryan, that these universal programs do have the benefit of actually lifting people up and lifting the standard of living for most people. But I do agree with Ta-Nehisi Coates in that we have to inject race in the conversation. I think that when these programs are sort of colorblind, at least in like the narrative we use to sell them, we'll still end up seeing different results for different people. And I think France is an interesting example of that. I grew up there. I'm not a data person like you guys, so I wish I had more than just like anecdotal information. But if you take a look at places like Paris, right? Like outside of Paris, there are all these suburbs where there's like concentrated poverty. And when you get there in person, like it doesn't take, you look at the numbers and the people who walk around you, and it's primarily Black people, like African immigrants, Arab immigrants. But France, has like a pretty robust social safety net. I think it has, people have much higher expectations from their government. So why are we seeing these ghettos like outside the city? Like, how is it that that even though there's like less concentration of poverty in France, when you look at the racial composition of who makes up the poor, like Black people and Arabs and, increasingly Asian immigrants are just like overrepresented. And I think that one of the reasons is that France hasn't had a civil rights movement. It prides itself on being colorblind. I don't think France actually does a census. They're very much like in the mindset of like, if you're a French citizen, then it's like égalité, fraternité, we're all in this together. But realistically speaking, that's not how it works out. There are second-class citizens, and, the standard of living is sort of higher for everyone, but for those at the bottom, it's just much higher. It's much more difficult to make a living. And there is rampant discrimination, for instance, when it comes to employment. And so I think we do have to be mindful, and for people like Bernie Sanders, I do think you have to be, you can't like hide from race,
No.
Right.
Yeah.
I've heard in France, correct me if I'm wrong, I am an uncultured American swine. I know like 2 words in French. But that...
Wait, which words? Which words? Which do you know?
Oui and baguette. I don't know.
Interesting. He's a hungry man. Cooper is a hungry man. He likes to eat.
Yes. Would you like a baguette? Oui, monsieur.
That's pretty good.
Somebody has told me, so I have no idea if this is true or not, but when they collect demographic data, when the government collects demographic data in France, they explicitly kind of forbid, when they collect like background data, they forbid the collection of demographic characteristics about race, ethnicity, and so on. Is that true?
I'm not sure. It wouldn't surprise me. But one thing I do know is that in the 90s, when I lived there, it used to be that when you applied for a job, so you didn't like describe your demographics on your application, but you had to send a photo.
Oh, wow. That's sneaky. That is... What was the justification for that? That's crazy.
I don't know. But yeah, so like my mom would attach her like little passport photo with her applications, and like of course would not get interviews because Suzanne Jucquat was clearly like an African woman. So
this is a bit of a tangent, but this is exactly how the Ivy League connived to keep Jews from taking over all the universities. That back in the day, like applications used to be much simpler. And since there was a pretty heavy emphasis on academic achievement back in the like 1920s, thereabouts, there was just like tons and tons of like sons and daughters of Jewish immigrants were coming up and actually just crushing the sort of wasps at academics, and just making up an increasing percentage of the enrollees of these universities. And so they came up with what is now standard application form in the United States for colleges, the essay, the doing service and personal stuff. And one way of
wow.
That's where that all comes from. And one way of one nice side effect of this for Harvard, Yale, and Princeton was that you could keep Rudolf Finkelstein from and bring in like Jeff Smith, who was 50 points below him on the standardized tests or whatever. And yeah, right. It's just like a sort of facially neutral thing, which did not, I think, as you're saying, reckon with, or in this case, was exacerbating a project of doing bigotry.
Hey, Ryan, was facially neutral a double entendre there? Was that intentional?
No.
Okay, just checking.
But
this is a good point. I wonder, what did you make of the? Do you remember the Trevor Noah stuff about when France won the World Cup? That it was after Africa that won the World Cup, and kind of there was pushback about, French nationalism and what it means to be French. And so there seems to be this kind of contradiction that maybe relates to the United States as well, about the ignorance of, or pretending that there isn't discrimination, and this desire for homogeneity, and that it doesn't matter in France what your ancestry is, you're French, and to be French is French, and that means one thing, and same thing here, you could say, right? Like we're all Americans. But that usually kind of occludes actual discrimination, and the political work it does usually serves to kind of push against fighting for equality. So I'm just wondering what you think the connection might be there, or if you think that's true, right?
Yeah, I think the French are much worse than Americans at that, actually. Anecdotally, I think you can be a person who looks like me in America, and be asked, where are you from? And if I say Chicago, that's good enough for an American. In France, in my own country, when I get asked where I'm from and I answer with the French town, people look at me like, no, but where are you really from? So there's just this definite, we're all very conscious of not being white. And of course, the, Portuguese origined French people don't get asked those questions. That's reserved for brown people. So I think America in that way is much better at playing the assimilation game. But at the same time, America is also much more explicit about race. I think that the concept of affirmative action would be very, I think it would be very offensive to the French government as an idea, because I think it would require really acknowledging these deep differences, and just the wide gap of discrimination and outcomes between people in a way that it's obviously affirmative action is under attack in the United States. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the fact that it even exists just puts the U.S. miles ahead of France, I think.
Yeah.
There are at least efforts to combat the inequality, even if they're sort of lackluster.
Yeah, I wonder if, so for those on the left who get in these bitter debates during the primaries and other times, I wonder what might be a way forward to kind of recognize the central role of race and the tendency for these outcomes that Ta-Nehisi Coates showed, right? It's definitely true. I mean, some astonishing facts that it's more likely that non-poor Black Americans are likely to live in a poor neighborhood than poor white Americans are to live in a poor neighborhood, right? So there are these systemic effects that are definitely racially charged, right? And so my feeling is most likely on the left, there isn't actually a disagreement in interest in terms of serving the needs of those that are disproportionately harmed by capitalism. But I wonder what the way forward is to try to, integrate and make allies so that there aren't these kind of oppositional perspectives.
Yeah, and I think that goes back a bit to the excerpt of the interview with James Baldwin, right? Oh, am I thinking of James Baldwin? No, I think I'm thinking of MLK. How do you get white people to sort of see beyond their own identity? Because, the way I read that passage from Martin Luther King and in a way from James Baldwin is that there's this incentive to hold on to your whiteness, particularly if you're in the middle class or the working class or the poor. You hold on to it because it's the one tiny advantage you have in life. And it's how do you communicate to people that this tiny advantage is so little, it's so meaningless in the grand scheme of things. You're not really squeezing your money's worth out of this race things, and there's much more in it for you to kind of join, anti-racist efforts, because the benefits to you will be greater. And I don't know if I'm like articulating that the best way I can, but I think that's an interesting question of basically how do you entice white people to engage in fights outside of themselves. And I think that like immigration in particular raises those questions a lot, like and I think that President Trump understands that too. Like when we talk about open borders and what it means to open the door to more people, from Mexico, from Honduras, from like the global South. And like the first place that like the conservatives like to go to is that like, well, these people are going for your jobs. They're going for, your opportunities. They're going for your public resources. And it's like, how do we get people out of that mentality, of just like absolute self-protection?
Yeah. I mean,
that's a great point.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, I mean, probably most obviously, like I am a white male person, and one doesn't want to think that like that is sort of
hey,
the
Coops,
end.
don't be so hard on yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself.
Everyone's instinctively drawn to something that can sort of excuse your own existence. Nobody wants to be the villain of history, and I think that that's definitely sort of just a little innate defensiveness, I guess, as to why I'm drawn to the Martin Luther King view of things. Even though it is, it's impossible to deny that in certain circumstances, at least relative to other people, whiteness and maleness does provide a privilege. But I think as you're talking about with France, the way if you have a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, the way to have a sort of collective consciousness of that is to build a sort of identity around cosmopolitan, multiracial, multi-ethnic, like sort of way of thinking about things. And to say that America is good because it has these characteristics, and is a matter of historical fact, black people have been in America since the absolute very beginning. Their roots go all the way to the very beginning, much further than people. All four of Donald Trump's grandparents are immigrants. And of American culture, how much of that is produced by black people or immigrants of various kinds, like the Jewish people who are heavily involved in Hollywood, jazz, blues, R&B, rock and roll, so many poets and writers and such. It's like just a fact of how this country is that it is and always has been a very diverse cosmopolitan place, and there's been massive resistance to that. I think of it, maybe as like a sort of family, and it's like the reaction to, it's like if you have a large family and like you have retrograde social views and it's like, oh, my brother is gay and I'm just going to try to write him off. It's like this person is not part of my life. Well, that does violence, it may in some way privilege me in terms of like inheriting the family money or whatever, but it does violence to me personally. It robs me of my sort of like communion with my fellow citizens, because the fact of that like black, as Baldwin says in that little debate, which by the way that's a debate with William F. Buckley, and Baldwin fucking kicks his ass. Like, it's not even close. But this is like the fact of the matter is we've been integrated in this country for a very long time. The corpses are full of the land is full of the corpses of my ancestors, and it's I think that tends to demonstrate maybe the problem with France's way of thinking about this is like if you have a sort of multiracial society, you can't just pretend as if that doesn't exist and as everyone is equal, because then you're just denying reality. But if you try to build on that actual foundation, maybe.
So if I may kick in my political theorist mode, I just, it makes me think, Vanessa's great point and question reminds me of John C. Calhoun, and Corey Robin writes about this in great ways. And, my students often find it miraculous and a kind of a discovery that the Confederacy wasn't just kind of sui generis, a bunch of monsters, mean people, which in a way, kind of just like the Nazis, kind of makes it just a blip that isn't just, it happens sometimes bad people are in power. No, it was an ideology and a philosophy, right, that was like perpetuated. And what happens is you have these ideals of the Declaration that say, right, all human beings are created equal. And that's so powerful, and it required a response. Like the cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, right, the VP of the Confederacy, he says, look, I'm going to be honest with you, basically. If the Declaration of Independence, if that premise that all humans are created equal is correct, we're monsters, we're terrible. Thank God, he says, thank God that's not true, because we would be monsters. We would be absolute, I grant you, we would be so bad. Thank God that was... Like the whole speech is like, it's the cornerstone speech. It's like, the Declaration is a sandy foundation. We have to make a new cornerstone of our civilization based on the actual truth. Both the Bible and science teach us that the white race is superior, right? And so just like, you wouldn't want your dog to be your master, and it's good for the dog for you to be the master of the dog. Well, naturally, the white race should be the master, right? And so he was literally making a philosophical argument rooted in science and religion to say that they were the good guys, right? This is a philosophical argument. Yeah. And so like that, and the way that they did that, so Calhoun then says, look, poor white people or middle-class white people, let's forget about these class differences, because there's only a small percentage of plantation owners that have like the bulk of the wealth, right? So let's say, look, you might not have the money, but we're all white, so we're equal, right? So Corey Robin talks about this. Calhoun appropriates the equality language to say we're all equally white, so don't worry about our class differences, right? Because we're all superior. And so like, the divide and conquer strategy is used in order for the rich to stay rich. And so they get the buy-in from people that aren't in the same, right, like wealth class. So in other words, racism is an ideology to help the rich stay rich, to get the buy-in of other people, right, and to divide and conquer. And this is done in so many ways all the time. This is what Trump does, of course, right? So like that, to say that it's a shifting of, no, they're the problem and we're all on the same team. It's the same move, right? That's the same way that Trump is able to make the poor, vulnerable refugee asylum seekers the bad guys, or foreign aid is the problem, right? It's like a magic trick so that you don't actually look at the rich. So it's just an important thing to see, right? And so if we can identify that for people, that could be the way forward.
It reminds me a little bit of the Republicans' response to AOC's proposal for a 70% marginal tax rate. And where they're like, they want to tax us at 70%. Sir, who is us? But like all of a sudden, like everyone is talking about we, like we all have $10 million sitting around.
That's right.
It's just pretty clever.
Yeah. It's like Joe the plumber, poor Joe the plumber and his millions.
We can't be spreading the wealth around. You never know. We're all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires here. Maybe to just sort of put a bow on this, I think that your way of looking at this, Alexia, is I think the most fruitful. To think of it not as like maybe a good or a bad thing. It's like it's kind of fraught and it depends on who you are. It's more about a sort of legitimating ideology. And you can have whiteness, in a way that and it's like in the case of the slave South, like for everyone except the planter class, it's really terrible. And then you could say, well, New Deal, mid 20th century whiteness, that's kind of a different story, as it is actually fairly equal and so on and so forth. But it's at the end of the day, it's sort of a way of allowing people to think about their themselves and how they relate to others. you can construct, I think, different ideologies, a different way of thinking, and maybe maybe it'll take and maybe it won't, but I don't think it's a foregone conclusion either way. Oh, and one final thing, actually, that I meant to mention earlier, that you look at thinking about the wages of whiteness. Well, one thing we've been seeing for the last 2 consecutive years is that the life expectancy of sort of downscale white people, people without a college degree, basically has been decreasing. And it's like unprecedented in, quote unquote, developed countries since like, the 1950s. And, what's the problem? Well, people are dying of alcoholism. They're dying of drug overdoses. It's sort of similar in a sense, though not as bad as what happened to Russia after the fall of communism, the kind of diseases of despair. And it seems like you could say, at least for that particular cohort of white people, like the whiteness thing is really kind of reaching the end of its rope in terms of structure, in terms of like material payoffs.
Yeah,
that's interesting, Ryan. So you're suggesting that maybe like the appeal to whiteness as a source of power and privilege won't be something that will work much longer because like just empirically it doesn't anymore? Is that, I mean, for some groups of people, is that what you're arguing, or what are you trying to say?
Well, I'm saying that in terms of these like material consequences for people who are living in society, like they're dying, in vast numbers, like 70,000 people, I think mostly white, died of opioid overdoses in 2018, I think, or 2017. No, I don't think I've seen the 2018 numbers. And I think, you could maybe just sort of try to get people to go even further in, get on this sort of like exterminationist ideology. It's like here's a white ideology that really didn't work out for a group of people. Would be like Nazi Germany. It's like this really, really didn't work out for like 12 million soldiers who got killed by the Russian winter and such. So I don't think it's foregone conclusion whether or not it'll sort of like which one will prevail in the minds of the people, but it's certain the bargain is looking worse and worse as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious to see how this will all sort of play out in debates around 2020. Because I think something that I've seen reactionaries and conservatives, like those are synonyms, like what I've seen a lot of people do is say, people like Tucker Carlson, like there's nothing wrong with being white. Like we're not, like we're under attack here for being proud of our ancestry as Italians, Irish, Belgians, or whatever, but when like a black person says that they're proud to be black, it's fine. And why isn't it when we do? And I just feel like it's a huge distraction. And then I feel like there's a connection being made between like the people on the left who talk about about having like a more robust social safety net, about, taxing wealth at a higher rate. All these people are part of this coalition that are, attacking your identity and they act like being white is a synonym of being privileged. But like, look at you, like, look at the town you live in, rural Ohio, where everyone is like dying of various avoidable diseases, like, and I think the left should think seriously about how to counter that narrative. Like, I don't think we can just ignore it. Like, we have to figure out a way to answer it, and like, I don't know. I've seen how like just giving facts to people doesn't work. No one cares about facts. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a way, I don't know if there's like an easy answer, but there has to be a way for us to communicate that like, No one's asking you to be ashamed of being white. It's just that when you say white pride, there's a whole history affiliated with that concept that is very scary to many of us. And also, but also we see you. Like, we see your suffering, and there are answers that are, like, not attacks on white people or on identity. Like, you know, we have, like, a class-based program that will benefit you. And it's part of being, you know, you have to be part of this multiracial, multicultural coalition, you know, to be in and for it to work. But I don't know. I mean, I'm rambling a little bit, but I just think that, like, I'm not sure the left has done a great job at, like, addressing these kind of sore points for people.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of phrasing the problem. And for me, at least, it reminds me that, and Ryan has mentioned this in a previous podcast, the basic pitch on the left and the right is either an embrace of difference or an embrace of a certain kind of unity and a friend-enemy distinction, like to invoke like a Carl Schmittian kind of thing, right? Like, the left needs to say that we see you, we embrace you, not because you're white, but because you're human. And because you're human, it doesn't matter if you're white, male, trans. So our coalition is universalist in the sense that we think there's unity in diversity, and we all should matter equally. That's what human equality means. The opposite view says you're only special because of this accidental feature you have, or this, right, you were born with this color skin. And that actually isn't recognizing your humanity, right? So we're actually the side that doesn't want you to feel guilty for the accident of your birth. We're the side that says that no one should be harmed or benefit because of the accident of their birth, right? And so, like, I think there's something compelling in that. And also the structural analysis, at least from the Marxist left, right, is that in the same way that racism and inequality isn't caused by individual choice or agency, neither is it your individual burden that you're white, right? So, like, it's actually the individualist liberal notion, that atomized picture of reality that would ascribe, and this is why certain centrist liberals have the white guilt problem, because they think, oh, if I'm just feeling guilty as a white individual, then that expiates my sins, and that's all I need to do is feel bad about myself. No, it's a structural fucking problem. So it's not you. It's like the whole history that has produced these results that we collectively need to recognize and do something about, right?
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you, but then
sometimes it isn't. Or
it's usually Ryan. It's actually usually Ryan.
I think that I'd be surprised if we could make up for past wrongs, wrongs that were, like, committed on a systemic structural level without creating programs that pay special attention to, like, people's accidental characteristics.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, they should.
So,
they should. They totally should. But that has nothing to do with guilt. Can we have
it both ways? Yeah. I mean,
do you see what I'm saying? Like, of course we should, like, I'm all about the reparations. I'm all about that. But, like, I think where most of the resistance comes from is this. It's actually like a spiritual notion of shame or guilt or something.
Okay,
right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Bree Joy, who is on the staff of Current Affairs with me, has a great article about that, in case your readers are interested, about how far shame can get us in getting people on our side. And I think her answer would be not that far if you're not very strategic about it.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah,
this is...
There's definitely, you it feels very instinctive and reactive, the way that people deploy that kind of stuff sometimes. It's like kind of with those kids. It's like that were harassing that, like, native fellow. That it was very just a sort of visceral reaction, I feel like. But and it's, as far as I can tell, wholly merited, despite the sort of Quillette Reason magazine pushback on that. But at the end of the day, I think it's not a very powerful tactic that's not probably not going to get you very far. I guess my attitude generally is that like you really don't need that many like downscale white people to have a majority coalition, and the number is lower every year. But
Okay.
Obama got a third of his election. His coalition was white people without a college degree, and you look at how he ran against Mitt Romney. He ran this like really pretty savage class war campaign. It's like Mitt Romney's coming for your job. Mitt Romney's a private equity wheeler dealer. He's gonna take your business apart and send your job to Mexico or whatever. In a way that kind of anticipates Trump a little bit in terms of like the rhetoric, and not the rhetoric on trade at least, and like financialization. But I think that's a decent glimmering of a kind of model to be like, just peel off. There's a hardcore people in this country that are they're lost. They're never going to vote for, Bernie or anybody else, because they're just gonna, like that lady who, it was like the first time she had voted in her life, and she was like 87 and ailing, and they took her to the polls and she voted straight Republican and then died immediately. And like that is like kind of where a lot of people are at, I'm afraid. But I think that there's maybe a critical mass of people who are kind of super enfranchised, of people in like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, to just be like, maybe they're probably not woke on race stuff at all, but like at the other hand, they don't really care that much about it. And if you give them like a decent sort of class message, maybe you could bring over the people you need to win those states. And I think that it's possible. And and that could be sort of a building block to be like in a coalition that would be like, we are trying to redress the grievances of history, which would be class stuff, and also some specific affirmative action things, reparation style, whatever you want, like Native Americans. Geez, like there's a lot of things to deal with. But
I think the only group that's gotten reparations, right, is because of Korematsu. There were reparations given because of the Japanese internment, but we haven't done that for any other group that's been harmed by the history of systemic violence, right? Like, I think if a Bernie presidency exists, there should be a lot of pressure. There's been a bill that never gets to the floor every year in the House, right, for just doing research on how, right, like. Yeah, so I mean, literally, it's not even a bill about like, here's the reparations that are owed. It's let's start a committee to do research into and you would think like the libertarians would love this shit because they're all about like debits and credits and like, oh, what is the actual amount owed to what groups based on like the causal chain of, so like that's actually what this is. It's like, let's do some research and figure out what generations of systemic racism has done to populations and what they're owed. I mean, you can't get more libertarian justice than that shit, but like, that won't even come up for a vote, So, we got to push for that, for sure.
Yeah.
Maybe President Harris can get it.
Yeah.
I think we got to talk about Kamala Harris, right? Like, we can't end this discussion without bringing up her candidacy, right? So, what do you think now that you've thrown her hat into the discussion ring? What are your thoughts on her candidacy?
My thoughts.
Sure. I don't really care what Ryan has to say. I hear what he has to say all the time.
I'll preface by saying this. I have very low standards for apologies. Like, just give me a half-ass apology, a half-ass explanation, and I'll take it, and we can move on. So, Kamala Harris has a pretty #problematic record, right? As DA of San Francisco, as California AG. There was a great piece in The Atlantic by Hannah Georges. There was another great piece in the New York Times by Lara Bazelon, if any of your listeners are interested, that kind of outlines some of the decisions that she made as a DA that really kind of challenged this image that she's crafting of her being a progressive DA, when she was in power, back in 2014. And I think she's tried to shift that narrative because Black Lives Matter had a huge impact on this country and how we talk about criminal justice issues. So she's trying to jump on the bandwagon, except that at the height of Black Lives Matter, Kamala Harris was still like a very carceral prosecutor. There's no two ways about it. And like today she announced that she's running, and I've heard that her motto is, or her slogan is, for the people, which is what the California AG would open their, hearing speeches with. So she's doubling down on the prosecutor image, super pro law enforcement. I think she's going to try to do some spin like she did on her book. And I'm offended that she thinks so lowly of us, that she, thus far, and maybe it will change, I'm hopeful, maybe it will change, that she won't sort of address head on like these glaring issues in her record. And so I'm really nervous going forward that, like, if she doubles down, the Democratic establishment, which appears to very much like her, will also double down. And people will give her passes by saying things like, we're putting this woman of color up to like a different, double higher standard with no, attention being paid to like the communities of color that her decisions impacted. Her like bragging about shutting down Backpage. Like, could we talk about the statistics of like sex workers of color? Even in the face of like activists begging her to take a different approach, she just... So, Kamala Harris, how do I feel about it? I'm not giving up on her. Like, I'm not giving up on the idea that she might figure out that she can't get away from this. And if she addresses it and gives like a somewhat convincing, just not even a justification. If she can like distance herself from the decisions she made and can tell us how, as a president, she would be different than she was as a prosecutor, I might be more open to some of the other good ideas that she's supporting. Like, I understand that she's for Medicare for all. I understand that she apparently has said explicitly that she wants to address, like, the huge discrepancy in, like, maternal health for Black women in this country, which is hella scary, hella bad. So I'm glad that she's out there talking about it. But I can't put blinders on. Let's see. What do you guys think?
That's very fair. You don't want people, you don't want to create the political incentive of just being like, unless you're perfect all the time, then you're just written off forever. But yeah, as you say, at the same time, you do want people to sort of explain where they're coming from, so that they're not, and sort of at least try to promise they're not just sort of flipping with the political winds, as if they flip back the other direction, and then, it'll be back to throwing everyone in jail again. And I suppose it's also worth noting that, not only was Harris a, very sort of average, I would say, not a super aggressive DA or prosecutor, but sort of in line with the standard when it comes to, prosecuting truancy and drug offenses and stuff like that. But at the same time, when Steve Mnuchin's foreclosure mill,
One
West, yes, what came up for, basically, like, this was one of the companies that was part of the great wave of crime that was like the housing bubble and the ensuing foreclosure crisis. She more or less just like let it slide, which is also what everyone else was doing at the same time, up to and including, President Obama and his secretary or his attorney general, both of them. And yeah, so you hope that she'll sort of come to Jesus or somebody.
Yeah, and the One West story is real disturbing, because it's not like her office entirely ignored the issue, and we are now, asking her to like, show a negative, to like explain to us why they didn't. Here's what happened. Like, her investigators, line attorneys, had like months of work. They found violations. The violations were easy to find because One West was so bad. They were formed in 2009, and they like ate up IndyMac. And I think they ate up some other, basically like they specialized in buying like really bad portfolios. And they were formed in 2009. So this is like they, for like a very specific reason, right? And so they would like sweep up these really bad portfolios and then be really aggressive about foreclosures. Like, I'm not pulling this out of my butt. You can find, like, there's good data that shows you just how bad One West was consistently. So it wasn't that hard for her investigators to put together a good case. And all she had to do was approve it. Like, the story is that she individually she ignored her own team's recommendation to press forward with a civil case against One West. And it's like really shady. And then apparently, like, there are reports from, I think I've seen it at least in The Intercept, but maybe in other places, that Steve Mnuchin personally had donated something like $20,000 to her campaign in the weeks prior to her declining to press forward with the case, which, like, maybe there's a connection, maybe there's not, but like, God, if it was any other financial institutions, I might be like, I don't know, you're right, maybe the case was weak. But with One West, it was impossible to have a weak case. Like, it's just not plausible. Yeah. So,
those are good points. It sucks, and it's not like the case like with, I think, Cory Booker. We could say game over. There's no way we can, as the left, right, support Cory Booker, right? Because like he's still giving speeches on behalf of charter schools, right? Like he's just like so in the pocket of, right, the neoliberal Wall Street crowd that I don't. Whereas Kamala Harris has lots of bad signs, but maybe there's a chance that she'll reverse course and own up to it, and like you say, make a statement about the presidency that would mark divergence. But there is just this danger that like so many centrist liberals think that identity politics means, well, we can have the same terrible capitalist neoliberal policies as long as there's a person of color and a woman. Like, that's enough, right? That's the form of progress that they see. So, hey, there's a woman that's heading up the CIA. Progress, we can now do violence to people, right? Like that should, but you would think that the same people here didn't think that when Sarah Palin was a VP. They didn't think, oh, yay, feminism, let's support Sarah Palin, right? So you would think that the logic could be kind of applied, and like Stacey Abrams, way better, right? Because actually the people of color and the marginalized groups will be helped by that candidacy, right?
Yeah, and here's the other thing, like, if all my options are bad, like if all my options are these really boring centrist liberals,
right.
Julie Brandt, Cory Booker, who's like okay on criminal justice actually, and then who's another boring one, Julian Castro. Oh my God, I almost so boring. Him and Kamala. If I had like 4 of the most boring Democrats the party could find, why would I pick the ex-prosecutor out of all of them if all other things are equal? So I don't know. I'm pre-stressed about this. I don't think it's going to end well. I've seen the comments on I've like shared the articles about Kamala Harris on Twitter, and just like the responses from Donut Twitter make me want to like leave this world, but we'll see.
Donut Twitter is not, they're not that numerous. They're you look at I've looked at the polls of Democrats who dislike Bernie Sanders, and it's like 8 to 10% consistently, something like that. And all of them are in Twitter or have journalism jobs. But it gives you a little distorted perspective. Well, I think that probably about wraps it up there. Vanessa, anything you want to mention before you take off? I know you got a show coming.
Yes. We got a show coming. The Current Affairs podcast is doing its first live show on Saturday, January 26th at the Rock and Roll Hotel in DC. You can find tickets on the Rock and Roll Hotel website or on Eventbrite. It's going to be fun. It's going to be weird because we're weird. So there are going to be costumes, live music, more costumes. Nathan bought a volcano with gummies that will go inside of them. Anyway, it's going to be a trip.
Amazing. Do you know what costume you're going to wear? Do you already have a costume?
I am not wearing a costume, but other people in the crew
maybe
will
you
be.
should.
It's a big surprise, though.
Right on. Everyone should go. Everyone should buy tickets. They should go. They should subscribe to Current Affairs. They should follow Vanessa Bee on Twitter.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
What's your handle at Dollar Bill?
That's right. It's DOLLA It's so long.
Don't you forget it.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm off to watch the new season of The Bachelor. So
nice.
Excellent.
Enjoy.
Godspeed.
It's a virgin this year, so it's all they talk about.
That's very exciting. Excellent. Well, enjoy that. And, come back on and tell us how The Bachelor went. Come back on anytime. Yeah. Anytime you want.
I'll keep you updated.
All right, good.
You.
Thanks, Vanessa. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Bye.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.